The wind hit me like a wall of knives before my boots even touched the ice. I had trained for cold. Every cadet at the academy trains for cold. But nothing prepares you for the moment the dropship doors open on Carnex 9 and the air itself tries to peel the skin from your face. My name is Rin Sodaval, and I am writing this account because I need someone, somewhere, to understand what I saw during those 4 days. Not the official report, the real story. 50 of us jumped from that ship. Only a handful walked out on our own legs. My species, the Kavesi, comes from a world with mild seasons and gentle rain. We are not built for extremes, but we are careful, disciplined, and patient, which is why so many of us make it through academy trials that break louder, prouder species. I told myself that discipline would be enough on Carnex 9. I was wrong about almost everything that week, but I was most wrong about that. The ice trial is the final survival exam before a cadet can graduate into active fleet service. 96 hours, a frozen valley with barely enough oxygen to keep your thoughts straight. Predators that hunt by scent and by sound, a beacon somewhere past the horizon that you must reach on your own, with only the supplies on your back. Instructors watch through drones, but they do not help unless your life reading drops into the red zone. That is the whole point. They want to see who breaks and who does not. 2 days before the drop, we sat in the briefing hall while Commander Hale walked us through the dangers in a flat, tired voice, like a man who had given this speech too many times to too many young people who did not truly believe him yet. Frostbite in under 10 minutes of exposed skin. Whiteout storms that could erase a trail in seconds. Ice wolves that hunted in packs of 6 or more, patient and silent until the moment they were not. He said all of this the way a teacher recites a poem they have memorized past feeling it. Most of the cadets in that room were nervous. I could smell it on some of them, a sharp, sour tension that Kavesi noses pick up easily. Fear has a scent, and that hall was full of it. Except for one seat, near the back, where a human girl sat with her boots up on the chair in front of her, drawing something on a small notepad instead of listening. Her name was Mira Voss. I had heard of her before that day, the way everyone had heard of her. She was the transfer cadet from a colony world called Kessa's Hollow, a place most of the galaxy only knew from official records that used one specific word to describe it: Deathworld. It was not a nickname, it was a real classification, given to any world where the environment itself was considered too hostile for ordinary settlement. Kessa's Hollow had earned that label honestly, according to what little information was public. When Commander Hale finished the section on ice wolves and asked if there were any questions, most of the room stayed silent, too tense to speak. Mira raised her hand without looking up from her notepad. "Are we allowed to bring snacks?" she asked. A ripple of laughter went through the hall, nervous and grateful for the break in tension. Commander Hale did not laugh. He looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something you cannot quite figure out, and then he simply said that standard rations were provided and moved on to the next slide. I did not laugh either. Something about the calm in her voice bothered me. Everyone else in that room was afraid, and fear, properly used, keeps you alive. It makes you check your gear twice. It makes you listen for the sound of something moving in the dark. A cadet with no fear at all seemed to me, in that moment, like a cadet who did not understand what she was about to face. I did not know yet how wrong I was about that too. The night before the drop, I could not sleep. I lay in my bunk running through the survival protocols in my head, the way my instructors had taught me, until the words started to blur together. At some point I got up to walk the corridor, hoping the movement would tire me out. That was when I saw Mira sitting alone in the common area, not sleeping either, but not anxious the way I was. She had a small toolkit spread across the table, and was calmly checking the stitching on her cold-weather gloves, testing each seam with her fingers. "You should be resting," I told her, because it felt like the kind of thing a responsible cadet should say. She glanced up at me, her expression unreadable. "I sleep fine before drops," she said. "Sleeping is easy. It's staying alive after that's the hard part, and you don't get better at that by lying in a bunk worrying about it." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and after a moment, I went back to my bunk anyway, because worrying, it turned out, was the only thing I was truly good at that night. The morning of the drop came fast, the way mornings do when you have not slept enough. We suited up in silence, checking each other's seals, tightening straps, running last-minute diagnostics on our survival packs. 50 cadets from a dozen different species, all of us bound for the same frozen valley, all of us about to be tested against a world that did not care whether we passed or failed. Commander Hale gave a final briefing before we boarded the dropship. He reminded us that this trial had a long history, that cadets before us had completed it, that the instructors would be watching from orbit and from ground drones the entire time, ready to pull anyone whose vital signs crossed into true danger. He said the words meant to reassure us, but I noticed he did not smile when he said them. As we lined up to board, I ended up standing near Mira again. Up close, I noticed something odd about her that I had not seen from across the briefing hall. While the rest of us fidgeted with our straps and checked our gear again and again out of nervous habit, her hands were completely still, not frozen with fear, simply still, the way a person's hands are still when they are doing something they have done 100 times before and no longer need to think about. "First big trial for you," I said, trying to make conversation, trying to distract myself from my own racing thoughts. "Something like that," she said, and there was the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of her mouth, gone before I could be sure I had seen it. I wanted to ask her what she meant by that, but the loading doors sealed behind us, and the dropship engines began their low, building roar, and the moment for questions passed. The flight down was rough, the way it always is when a ship cuts through a thick, cold atmosphere. I gripped the harness straps and focused on my breathing, the way we had been trained. Around me, other cadets did the same. A boy named Ethan Park sat across from me, his knuckles pale where he held onto his own straps, his jaw set tight. Beside him, a girl named Grace Ellis had her eyes closed, her lips moving slightly, though whether she was praying or simply reciting the survival protocols to herself, I could not tell. Only Mira looked out the small viewport at the white landscape rising up to meet us, watching it with the calm, careful attention of someone studying a map she already mostly knew. The doors opened, and the cold came in like a living thing. I stumbled out onto the ice, my boots crunching into a crust of frozen snow that gave way beneath my weight. The sky above was a pale, bruised gray, and the wind carried tiny needles of ice that stung any exposed skin within seconds. In the distance, jagged white peaks cut into the clouds, and closer, the valley stretched out in rolling drifts of snow that hid who knew what beneath their smooth surface. The dropship lifted away almost immediately, its engines roaring against the wind, and then it was gone, leaving 50 cadets scattered across the ice with nothing but our packs, our training, and 96 hours standing between us and the extraction beacon somewhere beyond the horizon. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings, trying to remember the terrain maps we had studied. Around me, other cadets were doing the same, some already moving with purpose toward their assigned starting headings, others standing frozen in place, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the cold, and the silence, and the danger, all wrapped into one endless white horizon. I caught one last glimpse of Mira before the drifting snow and the scattering cadets separated us. She was not looking around in confusion, the way the rest of us were. She had already pulled a small compass from her pack and was checking it against the position of the pale sun, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone starting an ordinary walk rather than a trial that had already, by reputation alone, broken cadets in years before ours. I did not understand it then. I told myself she was simply putting on a brave face, the way some people do when they are more afraid than anyone around them realizes. I told myself that the ice would humble her, the way it was already beginning to humble the rest of us, that within a day, her calm would crack like everyone else's. I was about to learn, over the following 4 days, exactly how wrong that assumption was, and exactly how much I still did not understand about the world she came from, or about her. But in that first hour, all I knew was the cold biting through my suit, the wind screaming across the open valley, and the small, sinking feeling in my chest that told me this trial was going to be far harder than anything Commander Hale's briefing had prepared us for. I checked my wrist unit. The extraction tally sat at 0. 50 cadets, still in the field. I tightened my pack straps, picked a direction, and started walking, because standing still on that ice, I already understood, was its own kind of danger. Behind me, somewhere in the white, I heard the faint crunch of Mira's boots moving away, at a steady, unbothered pace, already far ahead of where a first-hour cadet should reasonably be. I did not know it yet, but that pace, calm and certain, and completely without fear, was the first true clue to everything that was about to happen. I simply was not ready yet to understand what it meant. By the 6th hour, the cold had stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like an enemy. I had walked in a straight line toward my assigned heading, checking my compass every few minutes, watching the drifting snow for any sign of a hidden crevasse. My training told me to move steadily, to conserve energy, to avoid sweating inside my suit because sweat could freeze against the skin once the sun dropped. I followed every rule. I still felt the cold creeping into my joints, slow and patient, like it was waiting for me to make one mistake. Somewhere behind me, less than an hour into the trial, the first extraction call went out. I heard it over the open comm channel, a young voice, tight with panic, reporting a fall into a hidden crevasse. Not a deep one, thankfully, but enough to twist an ankle badly against the ice wall on the way down. The instructors confirmed the pull within minutes, and a retrieval drone streaked overhead not long after, carrying the injured cadet back toward the ships in orbit. One down. 49 of us remained. I told myself it was an accident, nothing more, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone in unfamiliar terrain. But less than 2 hours later, a second call went out. This one from a cadet whose oxygen regulator had frozen in the thin valley air, leaving him gasping and disoriented, until his own vital signs forced an automatic pull. Then a third call, a girl named Sophie Lane, who had wandered too close to a frozen lake and broken through a thin patch of ice into freezing water below. She was pulled out quickly, alive but shaking so hard from the cold that her voice on the comm was almost impossible to understand. By the end of the first day, the extraction tally on my wrist unit read 12. I made camp that night in a shallow depression between two snowdrifts, using it as a windbreak the way we had been trained. I ate a small portion of my rations, checked my suit seals twice, and tried not to think about how loud the wind sounded once the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Somewhere out in the dark, I could hear the distant howling of something that was not wind at all, low and rising, answered a moment later by another voice further away. Ice wolves, calling to each other across the valley. I did not sleep much that first night. On the morning of the second day, exhausted and stiff from the cold, I made a mistake. I was crossing a narrow ridge, trying to save time by cutting across terrain I had not fully checked, when the snow beneath my left boot gave way without warning. I went down hard, my pack twisting beneath me, my ankle catching awkwardly against a hidden rock beneath the snow. Pain shot up through my leg, sharp and immediate, and for a moment I simply lay there in the snow, stunned, the wind howling over me like it did not care one way or another whether I got back up. I forced myself to move. I checked the ankle, relieved to find it strained rather than broken, wrapped it as tightly as I could with the emergency bandage from my kit, and pulled myself upright using a nearby rock for support. Every step after that sent a dull ache through my leg, but I kept walking, because stopping felt more dangerous than the pain. It was an hour later, limping badly and beginning to lose track of my proper heading, that I stumbled, quite by accident, into a small camp tucked into the shelter of a rock formation. I expected, if I expected anything at all in my exhausted state, to find another cadet in worse shape than me, perhaps injured, perhaps simply overwhelmed the way so many of us clearly were. Instead, I found Mira, sitting calmly on a folded piece of insulated matting, a small portable stove hissing quietly in front of her, melting snow into water inside a metal cup. Her pack sat open beside her, neatly organized, and a section of the valley terrain was sketched out on a small notepad resting on her knee, marked with careful little notes in her own handwriting. She looked up at me without any particular surprise, as though cadets limping into her camp with strained ankles and exhausted expressions were simply a normal part of her morning. "You look terrible," she said, not unkindly, more the way someone might comment on the weather. "I fell," I admitted, lowering myself onto a nearby rock, my ankle throbbing with every heartbeat. Ridge gave way. She nodded, unbothered, and reached into her pack, pulling out a second bandage, thicker and better suited to a real strain than the thin emergency wrap I had used. "Let me see it," she said, and when I hesitated, she added, "I'm not asking for fun. A bad rap out here, and you lose the whole leg to the cold before you lose the ankle to the injury." I let her look. Her hands were quick and sure, unwrapping my hasty bandage and replacing it with her own, tighter and better balanced, checking the pressure with careful fingers before nodding, satisfied. "Where did you learn to do that?" I asked, watching her work. "Everywhere," she said simply. "You learn fast when the alternative is worse." I looked around her small camp properly for the first time. It was not simply neat. It was efficient in a way that felt almost unsettling, every item placed with clear purpose, nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. Her boots, drying carefully near the small stove without being close enough to damage the material. Her rations, portioned out in exact amounts rather than eaten in a single anxious sitting the way mine already had been. Even her sketched map of the terrain showed markings I did not recognize from our official survey data. Small notes about wind patterns and likely game trails that no instructor had given us. "You've made good time," I said, glancing at the position marked on her map, well ahead of where a cadet moving at standard pace should have reasonably reached by the second morning. "The terrain's honest here," she said, tightening the last strap on my new bandage. "It tells you what it's going to do before it does it. Wind patterns, snow density, the way the ground sounds under your boots. You just have to actually listen instead of fighting it." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but before I could, my wrist unit chimed softly, and I glanced down to see the extraction tally climb again. 15 now. Then, only a moment later, 16. Mira glanced at her own wrist unit, unbothered by the number, and then looked back at me with an expression I could not quite place, somewhere between mild curiosity and something almost like disappointment. "You should keep moving," she said, standing and beginning to pack away her stove with quick, practiced motions. "Ankles wrapped well enough to walk on if you're careful, but you'll want to favor it, and standing still too long out here just gives the cold more time to work on you." "You're leaving already?" I asked, surprised by how much the idea unsettled me. Being alone on that ice, even briefly, had already come to feel far more dangerous than it had that first morning. She paused, considering something, and then, in a tone that suggested she was making a small concession rather than offering real kindness, said, "You can walk with me if you want. Slower than I'd normally go, but you're less likely to fall off a ridge again if someone's watching your footing." Relief washed through me so strongly that I almost laughed. "I would appreciate that," I said, trying to sound more composed than I felt. We set out together not long after, Mira adjusting her pace to something closer to what my injured ankle could manage, though even slowed down. She moved with an ease across the icy terrain that I found myself struggling to match. She seemed to read the ground the way I might read a familiar hallway back at the academy, avoiding hidden weak spots in the snow before I could even see the subtle signs she was reacting to, adjusting her path around drifts that, she explained quietly, were likely to hide crevasses beneath their smooth surface. As we walked, I found myself curious about her in a way that went beyond simple survival instinct. I asked her, carefully, about Kessa's Hollow, the colony world she had come from. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought perhaps she would not answer at all. "It's not like this," she finally said, gesturing at the frozen valley around us. "Carnex 9 is cold, and it's dangerous if you're careless. But it plays fair. It doesn't hide things from you that it doesn't need to hide. Kessa's Hollow isn't like that." "What is it like?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, the way someone considers a question they have thought about often, but rarely had reason to answer aloud. "Gravity's heavier there, for one thing, about 1.5 times what you'd call standard. Everything that grows or hunts there grew up under that weight, so it's stronger and faster than anything built for a lighter world has any right to expect. Some of the plants can put you down in under a minute if you brush against the wrong leaf without gloves on, and the things that hunt do it in the dark, mostly, because our eyes are the weak point and theirs aren't." I felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "How does anyone survive growing up there?" I asked. "You learn early," she said simply, "or you don't get the chance to learn late." She said it without any drama in her voice, the way someone might explain a simple fact about geography, and that flatness unsettled me more than if she had told the story with fear or sorrow in her voice. We walked for hours after that, mostly in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Mira pointing out some detail in the terrain I would otherwise have missed. A patch of snow that looked solid but was actually a thin crust over open air. A faint scent on the wind that she identified as an ice wolf pack moving somewhere to the north, well outside any range that should concern us yet. A change in the wind's pitch that she said meant a temperature drop was coming within the hour, and sure enough, not long after, the cold deepened noticeably, forcing us both to tighten our suit seals against the worsening chill. By the time we made camp for the second night, my wrist unit's extraction tally had climbed to 23, nearly half the original 50, gone from the trial in less than 2 full days. I sat near the small stove, warming my hands, watching Mira methodically check her gear the way she had the night before I ever spoke with her properly. "Does it worry you?" I asked quietly. "How many people are being pulled?" She glanced at the number on her own wrist unit, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "It worries me a little," she admitted, "but not for the reason you'd think. It's not that the trial's too hard. It's that it's supposed to be hard in a way that teaches people something, and instead it sounds like it's just breaking them. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" I asked. "A hard trial makes you better if you get through it," she said, feeding a small piece of fuel into the stove's flame. "This is starting to sound like it's just making people give up. That's not the same thing at all." I did not fully understand what she meant that night, sitting exhausted and sore beside a small fire on an alien world, listening to distant howls carry across the frozen valley. It would take one more day, and a danger far greater than anything the trial's designers had ever intended, before I truly understood the difference she was describing. That night, before sleep finally took me, I asked her one more question, the one that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since the briefing hall 2 days earlier. "Are you ever afraid?" I asked. "Out here? At all?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small flame of the stove, and when she finally answered, her voice was calm, but there was something underneath the calm that I could not quite name. "Fear's useful when it teaches you something you don't already know," she said. "Out here, most of what should scare a person, I already learned to handle a long time ago, somewhere worse. So no, not really, not yet." I fell asleep turning that answer over in my mind, and somewhere far off in the dark, the wolves called to each other again, closer now than they had been the night before, though I would not understand exactly how much closer, or what it meant, until the following day. I woke on the third morning to the sound of Mira already moving, folding away her sleeping mat with quiet, practiced motions before the pale sun had fully cleared the mountains. My ankle had stiffened overnight, and it took me several long minutes just to work enough feeling back into my leg to stand without wincing. She waited for me without complaint, though I noticed she used the time to sharpen a small blade from her kit against a flat stone, testing the edge against her thumb with the same unhurried focus she seemed to bring to everything. "We're behind where I'd like to be," she said, once I was finally upright and moving. "Not behind the beacon deadline, behind where I'd like to be if something goes wrong." "Something like what?" I asked, tightening the last strap on my pack. "Anything," she said simply, and started walking. The terrain changed as the morning wore on, the open snowfields giving way to a narrower stretch of valley, hemmed in by tall walls of gray rock, ice clinging to the stone in thick sheets that occasionally cracked and shifted with a sound like distant thunder. Mira slowed here, more cautious than I had seen her the entire trial, checking the walls above us frequently as we walked. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Icefall," she said. "Warmer air moving through a valley this narrow loosens what's stuck to the rock. If it lets go while we're underneath it, we won't have much warning." I glanced nervously at the ice sheets clinging to the cliffs above us, suddenly far more aware of every distant crack and groan echoing through the narrow passage. We moved quickly but carefully through that stretch, and I found myself grateful, not for the first time, that I had stumbled into her camp rather than continuing on alone. It was somewhere in the middle of that narrow valley that we first heard the ice wolves properly, not distant howls carried on the wind, but a low, rhythmic panting sound, close enough that both of us stopped walking at once. Mira held up a hand, and I froze instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. She tilted her head slightly, listening in a way that reminded me of an animal reading its surroundings, rather than a person simply paying attention. After a long moment, she relaxed, though only slightly. "Packs moving parallel to us," she said quietly. "Not hunting yet, just curious, probably. They'll have smelled us a while ago." "Probably," I repeated, my voice tighter than I intended. "They tend to test before they commit," she said, resuming her steady pace, though I noticed she had shifted her grip on her walking pole into something closer to how a person might hold a weapon. "Ice wolves aren't reckless. They don't waste energy chasing something that looks ready to fight back. Right now, we don't look particularly interesting to them. Let's keep it that way." We walked the rest of that narrow valley stretch in tense silence, and though I never saw the pack directly, I caught glimpses once or twice of movement among the rocks above us, pale shapes that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them properly. By the time we emerged into open terrain again, my shoulders ached from how tightly I had been holding them. It was around midday, while we paused briefly to eat a small portion of rations, that Mira first mentioned the storm. "Wind's shifting," she said, tilting her face slightly into the breeze, her expression distant and thoughtful. "Coming from the northern ridge now instead of the west. That usually means weather's building up behind the mountains." I checked my wrist unit's basic weather display, a simplified readout meant to give cadets rough guidance during the trial. It showed nothing unusual, just standard cold and clear conditions projected for the remainder of the day. "The instruments don't show anything," I told her. "The instruments are reading what's already happened," she said, "not what's about to." She did not seem particularly concerned by the discrepancy, simply filing the observation away, the way she seemed to file away every small detail of the world around her. "Keep it in mind." That's all. I did keep it in mind, though at the time I assumed her caution was simply an old habit from a more dangerous world, not something specifically relevant to Carnex 9. I would understand my mistake only much later, once it was almost too late to matter. As we continued through the afternoon, our conversation returned, gradually, to the topic that had been sitting quietly between us since the previous night. I found myself curious, in a way I could not entirely explain, about the details of her life before the academy, the specifics that made someone treat this brutal, deadly trial as something almost gentle by comparison. "You said the terrain here plays fair," I said, picking my way carefully around a patch of thin-looking snow she had silently pointed out a moment earlier. "What does terrain that doesn't play fair look like?" She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "There's a plant back home we call sleep vine, though that's not really what it does. If the leaves brush against exposed skin, they release something that shuts down your muscles within about a minute. Doesn't kill you outright, just leaves you lying there, unable to move, while whatever's nearby figures out whether you're worth eating." I felt my stomach turn slightly at the calm, matter-of-fact way she described it. "That sounds horrifying," I said. "It's just how the world works there," she said, with a small shrug that somehow made the statement more unsettling rather than less. "You learn where the sleep vine grows before you learn much of anything else. Kids on Kessa's Hollow can usually identify it by scent alone before they're old enough to read." "And the animals?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. "The ones that hunt?" "Depends on the season," she said. "There's a pack hunter we call a night runner, about the size of a large dog, but faster than anything that size has any right to be, especially in the dark. They hunt in groups, the way the ice wolves here do, but they coordinate better. One group drives, another waits. If you hear one, there are usually at least 3 you haven't heard yet." "How do you survive that?" I asked, genuinely struggling to imagine a childhood spent alongside dangers like that. "You learn their patterns," she said. "Same as anything else. Night runners won't cross open ground with strong light on it, not because they're afraid of light exactly, but because it takes away their advantage. So you learn to build your shelters with that in mind. You learn which plants make good torches, which ones burn too fast to be useful, which ground gives good footing if you need to run, and which ground will slow you down and get you caught." I found myself struggling to reconcile the calm, steady voice describing these things with the reality of what she was describing, a childhood spent constantly aware of threats that would have paralyzed most cadets I knew with fear before they ever set foot outside a shelter. "Doesn't it ever feel like too much?" I asked quietly. "Growing up like that." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I wondered if I had asked something she did not want to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual flatness, something closer to genuine feeling coloring the words. "When you're little, yeah," she admitted. "Everyone's scared at first, but being scared of something you can't do anything about doesn't help you. It just wastes energy you need for actually surviving it. So you learn, pretty early, which fears are useful and which ones are just noise. The useful ones you keep. They keep you sharp. The rest you have to learn to set aside, because carrying all of it at once will get you killed just as fast as any night runner will." "A luxury tax," I said, half to myself, remembering something close to those words from our conversation the night before. She glanced at me, a faint surprised smile crossing her face, there and gone quickly. "Something like that," she said. We fell into a comfortable silence after that, walking steadily through the afternoon as the wind, exactly as she had predicted, began to pick up noticeably, carrying a sharper edge that had not been present that morning. My wrist unit's weather display finally updated, showing a storm warning building along the northern ridge, though the projected severity still registered well within the parameters the trial's designers considered manageable. Mira checked the same readout on her own wrist unit and frowned slightly, the first genuine concern I had seen cross her face since the trial began. "That's reading low," she said quietly. "Low compared to what?" I asked. "Compared to what the wind's actually doing," she said, glancing up at the darkening clouds gathering along the distant ridgeline. "Instruments here weren't built with someone like me giving input on what real weather patterns can do. They're calibrated for what this world usually throws at cadets, not what it's capable of on a bad day." I felt a fresh knot of anxiety tighten in my chest, though I told myself, not entirely successfully, that the instructors monitoring us from orbit would surely notice any serious danger long before it became a genuine threat. As the afternoon wore into evening, the extraction tally on my wrist unit continued its steady climb. 27, 29, 31, more than half the original 50 cadets, gone from the trial, pulled for injuries, exhaustion, or simple inability to continue in conditions that seemed determined to grind every one of us down to nothing. We passed, near dusk, close enough to see another small group of cadets making camp in a sheltered hollow between two rock formations. Among them, I recognized Ethan Park, the boy who had sat across from me on the dropship, his face drawn and exhausted, his movements sluggish in a way that worried me even from a distance. Beside him, Grace Ellis sat wrapped tightly in an emergency blanket, shivering despite the extra layer, her eyes distant and unfocused in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the early signs of hypothermia we had been warned about in briefings. Mira paused, studying the small camp with a careful, assessing gaze. "They're not doing well," she said quietly, more an observation than a judgment. "Should we help them?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, glancing between the darkening sky and the struggling cadets, and I could see her weighing something in her mind, some careful calculation I did not fully understand. "Not yet," she said finally. "If we push our pace to check on every struggling group, we won't have anything left in reserve if something actually goes wrong later. Right now they're tired and cold, but they're not in immediate danger. The instructors are still watching. If it gets worse, they'll be pulled the same as anyone else." I did not entirely like the answer, but I recognized, even then, that there was a careful logic behind it. The same kind of logic that had kept her calm and steady through 3 days that had broken more than half of our original group. Still, I noticed her glance back toward that small camp more than once as we continued on, and something in her expression told me she was filing away its location, the same careful way she filed away every other detail of the world around her. We made camp that third night earlier than usual, tucked into a narrow crevice between two large boulders that offered decent shelter from the strengthening wind. Mira worked with quiet efficiency, reinforcing our small shelter with extra insulation from her pack, checking and rechecking the seals on both our suits before allowing either of us to settle in for the night. "You're more careful tonight," I observed, watching her secure a final strap across the makeshift shelter's opening. "Wind's still shifting the wrong way," she said, not looking up from her work. "And it's shifting faster than it should, this late in the day. I don't like it. The instructors would warn us if it was actually dangerous," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I found myself less certain of them than I wanted to be. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable in the dim light of our small shelter. "Maybe," she said, "but instructors are working off the same instruments that already read this valley wrong once today. I'd rather be over-prepared for nothing than under-prepared for something." I thought about arguing further, some part of me still clinging to the reassurance that the trial's designers, with all their experience and technology, surely understood this world better than one cadet's instincts, however sharp those instincts might be. But something in the growing howl of the wind outside our shelter, rising steadily even as we settled in for the night, kept the argument from ever quite leaving my mouth. Instead, I found myself simply watching her work, methodical and unhurried despite the visible tension in her shoulders, and thinking back to something she had said earlier that day, about learning which fears were useful and which ones were simply noise. For the first time since the trial began, I realized, watching her double-check every seal and strap with a focus that bordered on genuine unease, that whatever fear I was seeing in her now was not noise at all. It was the useful kind, the kind she had told me she kept. And somewhere out in the darkening valley beyond our shelter, the wind continued to rise, carrying with it the first distant, rising howl of ice wolves calling to each other, across a landscape that was, I was slowly beginning to understand, about to become far more dangerous than anything the official trial parameters had ever accounted for. My wrist unit chimed once more before I finally allowed myself to close my eyes. The extraction tally had climbed to 34. 16 of us remained scattered across that darkening valley, and somewhere among the rising wind and the distant howls, something was building that none of the instructors watching from their orbital comfort had yet begun to understand. I woke to the sound of the shelter wall shuddering under a gust of wind, so strong it felt, for one disoriented moment, like something had physically struck the rock beside us. Mira was already awake, already moving, her expression sharp and focused in a way I had not seen from her before. Outside our small shelter, the wind had grown from a steady howl into something far more violent, a full roar that seemed to come from every direction at once, carrying with it a stinging wall of ice that reduced visibility to almost nothing the moment I peered out past the shelter's edge. "Screamer," Mira said, pulling the last of her gear together with quick, efficient movements. "Instructors call them that. Storm that builds faster and hits harder than the standard weather patterns account for. This one's outside anything the trial parameters were supposed to allow." "How bad?" I asked, my voice nearly lost beneath the roar of the wind. "Bad enough that the drones probably can't fly steady in it," she said, "which means if anyone out there is in real trouble right now, the instructors might not see it in time." The thought sent a fresh wave of cold through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I thought immediately of Ethan and Grace, the small, struggling camp we had passed the evening before, already exhausted and cold long before this storm had begun building around them. Mira seemed to be thinking the same thing, her jaw tight as she shouldered her pack. "Their camp's maybe 20 minutes from here, the way we came yesterday," she said. "If they're still in that hollow, the wind's going to funnel straight through it once the storm reaches full strength. We need to move." We stepped out of our shelter into a world that had transformed overnight into something almost unrecognizable. The gentle drifting snow of the previous days had become a churning wall of white, the wind driving ice crystals so hard against exposed skin that even the brief moment it took to adjust my hood left my face stinging. Visibility stretched barely a few body lengths in any direction, and the roar of the wind made ordinary conversation nearly impossible without shouting. Mira moved through it with a confidence that seemed, even now, faintly unnatural, navigating by some combination of memory and instinct that I could not begin to follow on my own. I stayed close behind her, gripping a length of rope she had tied between us before we left the shelter, trusting her sense of direction completely, because my own had already dissolved into useless confusion within the first few minutes of walking. It took longer than the 20 minutes she had estimated, the storm slowing our pace considerably, but eventually, the rock formation sheltering the small hollow camp emerged from the white chaos ahead of us. Even before we reached it properly, I could hear voices raised in genuine alarm over the roar of the wind, and beneath that, something else, a low, coordinated series of howls that raised the hair on the back of my neck. We came around the final rock formation to find the small camp in genuine crisis. The storm had partially collapsed one side of their shelter, exposing several cadets directly to the wind, and beyond them, moving through the swirling snow with an eerie, coordinated patience, I caught glimpses of pale shapes circling the camp's edges. The ice wolf pack, driven down from higher, more exposed ground by the storm, had found easier prey waiting for them in the sheltered hollow below. Ethan was struggling to hold the damaged shelter wall in place with his bare hands, his gloves apparently lost or damaged, while Grace lay curled against the rock, barely responsive, the early stages of serious hypothermia clearly visible in her pale, unfocused expression. Two other cadets I did not recognize were attempting, with limited success, to signal for extraction, their comm units apparently struggling against the storm's interference. Mira took in the scene in a single sweeping glance, and something in her posture shifted immediately, the calm, unhurried confidence I had grown used to over the past 3 days, sharpening into something more focused and decisive. "You," she said to me, her voice cutting clearly through the wind, despite not being raised into a shout. "Get to Grace. Body heat and the emergency blanket from my pack. Side pocket. Don't let her fall asleep. Keep her talking if you can." I did not question her. I moved immediately, dropping beside Grace and pulling the thick emergency blanket from Mira's pack, wrapping it around both of us as I had been trained, speaking to Grace in a low, steady voice, asking her simple questions to keep her attention anchored, despite her clear exhaustion. Mira, meanwhile, moved toward the damaged shelter wall, helping Ethan brace it back into place with quick, practical adjustments, using tools from her own pack to secure it more firmly than his numbed hands had managed alone. All the while, her attention remained clearly split toward the swirling snow beyond the camp's edge, tracking the pale shapes moving through it with the same careful attention she had shown the day before in the narrow valley. "They're testing us," she said, loud enough for the whole group to hear over the wind. "Storm's driven them down here and made them hungrier and bolder than usual. We need light and noise, now, before they decide we're worth the effort." One of the other cadets, a boy I did not know, fumbled with a small emergency flare from his kit, his hands shaking too badly from the cold to strike it properly. Mira crossed to him in a few quick strides, took the flare from his hands without any unkindness in the gesture, and struck it herself in one smooth motion. The flare burst into brilliant light, cutting through the swirling white storm and casting harsh, flickering shadows across the camp. The pale shapes at the camp's edge hesitated, drawing back slightly from the sudden light, though they did not retreat entirely. "That'll buy us a few minutes," Mira said, her voice tight with concentration. "Not much more." It was in that moment, with the storm roaring around us and the wolves circling just beyond the flare's reach, that one of them broke from the pattern entirely, a larger shape than the rest, moving with sudden, decisive speed toward the weakened edge of the camp, where Ethan still struggled to hold the shelter wall steady. Mira moved before I fully understood what was happening, placing herself directly between the approaching wolf and the rest of the group, her stance low and steady despite the howling wind, her voice dropping into something firm and commanding that cut clearly through the storm. "Not tonight," she said, to the wolf or to the storm, or perhaps simply to herself, and stood her ground as the animal drew closer, circling briefly at the edge of the flare's light, sizing her up the way a predator sizes up anything standing between it and an easier meal. I watched, my heart hammering, torn between the urgent need to keep Grace stable beside me and the equally urgent fear for Mira standing alone against something that outweighed her considerably and clearly did not fear the cold the way the rest of us did. But Mira did not retreat, and she did not panic. She held her ground with the same calm, careful confidence I had seen in her from the very first moment on the dropship, reading the animal's movements the way she had read every dangerous thing on this world since the trial began, anticipating its shifts in weight and posture with an ease that spoke of countless similar encounters somewhere far more dangerous than this frozen valley. After a long, tense moment that felt far longer than it likely was, the wolf drew back, apparently deciding, as animals often do when a target proves less vulnerable than expected, that the effort was not worth the risk. It retreated into the swirling storm, its pack following close behind, their howls fading gradually beneath the roar of the wind, until finally, blessedly, they were gone entirely. Mira exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, though she did not fully relax, her attention still sweeping the storm around us for any sign of the pack's return. "Everyone stays close," she said, moving quickly to help reinforce the shelter properly, now that the immediate threat had passed. "Storm's not done yet, and I'd rather not test our luck a second time tonight." We worked together through the remainder of that long, difficult night, reinforcing the shelter as best we could, keeping Grace and another cadet, who had begun showing early signs of hypothermia, warm and talking, taking turns watching the storm's edge for any sign of the pack's return. Mira moved between every task with the same tireless focus, checking on each of us in turn, adjusting bandages, redistributing supplies, offering quiet, practical guidance whenever panic threatened to take hold among the exhausted, frightened cadets around her. Sometime before dawn, the storm finally began to weaken, its violent roar softening gradually into something closer to the steady wind we had grown used to over the previous days. As the first pale light of morning began filtering through the retreating clouds, I finally allowed myself to check my wrist unit, half afraid of what the extraction tally might show after a night like the one we had just survived. It read 50. Every cadet still remaining in the field at the start of that storm had made it through the night, not through the intervention of instructors watching from the safety of orbit, whose drones had, exactly as Mira predicted, struggled uselessly against the violent winds throughout the worst of the crisis. Through her. I looked at her in the pale morning light, exhausted, her suit torn slightly along one sleeve from the night's efforts, and felt something shift in how I understood her, and understood, more broadly, everything I thought I knew about fear and danger, and what it truly meant to be prepared for the worst a world could offer. She caught me watching her, and offered a small, tired smile, the most open expression I had seen from her since the trial began. "Still 16 of us standing," she said quietly, glancing around at the exhausted but very much alive group scattered across the storm-battered camp. "That's better than I expected, honestly." I thought in that quiet moment of everything she had told me over the past 3 days, about fear that helped, and fear that only wasted energy, about a childhood spent learning dangers that made this entire trial, storm and wolves and all, feel almost survivable by comparison. I did not fully understand yet how right she truly was. That understanding would come only a short while later, once the extraction ships finally arrived, and the instructors began to piece together exactly what had happened out on that ice during the worst night of the trial's long history. The extraction ships arrived a little after midday, their engines cutting through the last of the storm's lingering clouds as they descended into the valley, one after another, gathering the remaining 16 cadets scattered across the ice. I remember the strange quiet that settled over our small group as we watched them approach, a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something harder to name, the particular stillness that comes after surviving something you were not entirely sure you would survive. Grace, wrapped warmly in a proper medical blanket now, managed a weak but genuine smile as the first ship touched down, and Ethan, his hands finally treated for the cold exposure he had suffered, helping to hold their shelter together, offered Mira a quiet, heartfelt thanks that she accepted with a small nod, characteristically brief but not unkind. We boarded the ships in small groups, and I found myself, by simple chance, seated near the same viewport I had looked through on the journey down 4 days earlier, watching the frozen valley shrink beneath us, the narrow crevice where we had sheltered from the storm, barely visible among the endless white terrain that had tested us so thoroughly. Commander Hale met us personally in the debrief hall aboard the orbital station, and I noticed immediately that his usual composed, slightly tired demeanor had been replaced by something more alert, almost unsettled. He moved through the returning cadets quickly, confirming names against a datapad, his expression tightening further with each name he checked off. When he reached Mira, he paused longer than he had with any of the others, studying her with an expression I could not entirely read, somewhere between professional curiosity and genuine astonishment. "Cadet Voss," he said, "I'm going to need you to walk me through last night in detail, all of it." She did, in the same calm, unembellished tone she had used to explain nearly everything to me over the previous 4 days, describing the storm's early warning signs, the decision to move toward the struggling camp, the confrontation with the wolf pack, and the long night spent reinforcing the shelter and keeping everyone stable until the storm finally passed. She spoke of it the way someone describes a routine task completed under difficult but ultimately manageable circumstances, without any of the drama or self-importance I might have expected from someone recounting what had genuinely been, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary display of skill and composure under pressure. Commander Hale listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing down at his datapad, cross-referencing her account against whatever fragmented sensor data the drones had managed to capture before the storm overwhelmed their systems. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him choosing his next words carefully. "The storm that hit last night," he finally said, "was rated well above what this trial's parameters are designed to allow for. It should never have reached that intensity this early in the season, and our instruments failed to properly flag its approach until it was already at full strength. That failure very nearly cost this academy 16 cadets in a single night." "I noticed the wind shifting wrong the day before," Mira said simply. "Figured it was worth being careful." Commander Hale studied her for another long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, an acknowledgement passing between them that went beyond simple official protocol. "Your intervention last night," he said, "is the reason every remaining cadet in this trial is alive right now, rather than facing a very different outcome. I want that clearly on the record." I watched Mira absorb this praise the same way she absorbed most things, with a small, thoughtful nod, neither dismissing it nor allowing it to visibly affect her composure. Later that day, once the medical checks and initial debriefs had finished, the instructors called a smaller, more informal gathering of the remaining 16 cadets to formally close out the trial. Commander Hale stood before us, along with 2 other instructors I recognized vaguely from earlier briefings, their expressions still carrying traces of the same unsettled alertness I had noticed since our return. "This trial's completion rate," Commander Hale said, addressing the group, "was significantly lower than any previous iteration in this academy's recorded history, even before accounting for last night's unexpected storm. We will be reviewing the terrain parameters, the timing of this season's deployment, and the calibration of our monitoring instruments extensively in the coming weeks." He paused, glancing briefly toward Mira before continuing. "For the record, I would like to ask each of you to rate the overall difficulty of this trial, based on your personal experience, for our internal review." The other cadets answered in turn, their responses ranging from exhausted admissions of genuine terror to careful, diplomatic descriptions of extreme difficulty. When my turn came, I found myself describing, honestly, the hardest 4 days of my life, the cold that never fully left my bones even now, the fear that had followed me every single hour until the moment those extraction ships finally arrived. When Commander Hale turned to Mira, the room seemed to hold its breath slightly, everyone present clearly aware, by that point, of exactly how differently she had experienced the same 4 days the rest of us had barely survived. She considered the question seriously, the same careful, thoughtful expression I had come to recognize over our time together, before finally answering. "Honestly," she said, "it was too easy." A ripple of quiet disbelief moved through the room, though no one laughed the way they had in that first briefing hall 4 days earlier. Whatever doubt anyone might have carried into that trial about her calm, unbothered demeanor had been thoroughly answered by everything that had happened since. "Too easy," Commander Hale repeated slowly, not challenging her, simply seeking to understand. "The cold's real," she said, "and the wolves are real, and that storm last night was worse than it should have been, I'll give you that. But none of it asked anything of me that I hadn't already learned to handle a long time ago, somewhere that doesn't give you 4 days of warning before things get difficult. Where I grew up, The equivalent of last night's storm is just called Tuesday. She said it without any arrogance in her voice, without any intention of diminishing what the rest of us had gone through. It was simply, as she had told me days earlier beside a small stove in the freezing dark, an honest calibration against a childhood that had genuinely been harder than anything this valley had offered. Commander Hale studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, something close to a small, tired smile crossed his face. "I believe you," he said quietly, "and I think this academy has some serious reconsidering to do about what our trials are actually measuring, going forward." The gathering ended not long after, the instructors dismissing us to rest and recover before our official return to standard academy schedules. As the room slowly emptied, I found myself standing beside Mira near the viewport, looking down at the pale curve of Carnex 9 turning slowly beneath the station, the frozen valley that had tested us so thoroughly, now nothing more than a distant white smudge against the darkness of space. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for letting me walk with you. I don't think I would have made it through alone." She glanced at me, and something genuine passed across her expression, warmer than the careful composure she had maintained through most of the trial. "You did fine," she said. "Better than fine, actually, once you stopped fighting the terrain and started listening to it instead." I thought of everything the past 4 days had taught me, not just about survival, about frost and wind and the patient danger of predators moving through the dark, but about fear itself, and the difference between the kind that protects you and the kind that simply wastes the energy you need to actually survive. "I have a request," I said, before I could talk myself out of it. "For my next field assignment, once we're both cleared for active duty, I'd like to request you as my partner, if that's something you'd consider." She was quiet for a moment, studying me with the same careful, assessing gaze she had used on that predator during the worst of the storm, and then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said, "though fair warning, wherever the fleet sends us next, it's probably not going to be nearly as calm as this trial turned out to be." I found myself laughing, a real laugh, the first one in 4 exhausting days, and she allowed herself a small smile in return. Already, I could tell, thinking ahead toward whatever challenge might come next, already leaving this frozen, deadly valley behind as little more than a minor, mildly interesting chapter in a much longer story. In the weeks that followed, the Academy quietly revised its trial protocols, adding new calibration standards for extreme weather monitoring and reconsidering, in ways that were never fully explained to cadets like me, exactly how future trials involving human candidates from certain colony backgrounds ought to be structured and evaluated. I heard, secondhand, that Commander Hale had submitted a formal report recommending an entirely new classification system, one that accounted for the simple, uncomfortable truth that some cadets arrived at the Academy already having survived things far harder than anything a standard trial could reasonably simulate. I think of that report sometimes, and of everything I learned standing beside Mira on that frozen valley, watching her move through danger the rest of us barely survived with the calm, practiced ease of someone completing an ordinary task. I think about how easily the galaxy had underestimated her, and how easily, in turn, we had misunderstood an entire species by measuring them only against worlds gentle enough to be considered fair. The Ice Planet trial broke 50 cadets that season, more than any trial before it, a fact the Academy would spend months quietly reviewing and revising in its wake. But it never once came close to breaking her. And somewhere out among the stars, waiting for whatever assignment came next, I suspect she was already looking past Carnex 9 entirely, already wondering, in that quiet, unbothered way of hers, what real difficulty might actually feel like when it finally came.